Welcome to the Fear and Greed Business Interview. I'm Sean Aylmer. Given the extraordinary strength of the employment market now, you'd think plenty of workers would be taking the opportunity to change jobs and secure a better deal. But that's not happening, according to new data from economic research house E61 Institute. And there are plenty of reasons, from IR hurdles and low wages growth to non-compete clauses and high house prices. Michael Brennan is the CEO of the E61 Institute and former chair of the Australian Productivity Commission. Michael, welcome to Fear and Greed.
Thanks, Sean. Thanks for having me. It's great to be here.
This is an incredibly strong labour market and has been for a couple of years. And in actual fact, for the last decade, it's been getting stronger in terms of the unemployment rate, notwithstanding what's happened in the last few quarters. Are people taking advantage of that and changing jobs?
Well, it's interesting. You're absolutely right on a lot of the vital signs about the labour market. Very high participation rate, strong hours worked, low unemployment rate. It all looks pretty strong. One of the mysteries, of course, has been low wage growth. But one of the things that we've noticed is that there's been a long-term slowdown in the rate at which people switch jobs. So the movement of people from one job to another, the rate at which that's occurring has slowed. Notwithstanding that, one of the key findings of this piece of research is that job switching, particularly for young people, is one of the key ways that they achieve pay increases. It's one of the mechanisms by which pay does rise, such that those who switch jobs on average on our research, tend to have pay outcomes 9 percentage points better than those who didn't switch jobs. And so it's important that that mechanism be allowed to operate to its full effect.
Okay, a couple of things there, which I'll come to the young people, but I'm more interested about me right now, Michael, the older people. The idea, though, that people aren't shifting jobs as much as they were. Why is that?
Well, it's not altogether clear. It's been a reasonably long-term trend since the early 1990s. Obviously, during COVID, there was a particular period where job switching slowed, but that was partly a policy intervention in the form of JobKeeper, which was deliberately aimed at maintaining the link between existing employers and their existing employees. Since JobKeeper was removed, we have seen a little bit of an uptick in that rate of job switching, but it's still not enough to reverse what has been that long-term trend. Now, some of it could be age-related. The average age of the workforce is a little older now than it has been in the past, and older workers tend not to switch jobs quite as rapidly and as readily as younger workers. But it could be the policies playing a role. I mean, we have looked at issues like the prevalence of these non-compete agreements, the non-compete clauses in employment contracts, which hadn't had a lot of attention in policy circles, but does look as though it's more prevalent than you might think. There are a range of other things like occupational licensing, potentially housing, barriers to moving house like stamp duty. So it could be a range of these things that are just inhibiting the mobility, just putting up barriers to the ability of people to change jobs.
It's kind of intuitively, I would have thought it went the other way. COVID is a specific period. It's an outlier. But technology, you would think, would better enable people to change jobs, wouldn't it? Or am I getting the wrong end of the stick there, maybe?
No, I think there is a lot to that. And of course, it is, so as is so often the case, it's the modern conceit to think that the pace of change has never been so rapid. And we have the cliched view that young people starting in the workforce today will have however many jobs, however many careers. The brute reality is people are actually changing jobs less than a generation ago. So once again, the data, as it so often does, kind of pricks the conventional wisdom a little bit.
Yeah.
You're right. I mean, technology could be an enabler. It could also operate in the other way, to the extent that people develop an expertise in using capital, using technology that is specific to the firm. Maybe that makes it more attractive for them to stay put.
Okay, so we do have some people shifting, and was it 9% you said, the increase if people do shift?
Yeah, 9 percentage points. It's about $7,500 on average. So we're talking in percentage points, because what we're really looking at is the experience of those people who switch jobs against the counterfactual of those who don't switch jobs. And it's basically a 9 percentage point difference between those two. That's the differential, the uplift, if you like, that the job switchers receive on average.
Is that not high enough to get enough job switchers going? Is that kind of the bottom line here? The incentive isn't great enough?
So that's not altogether clear because it's not clear how that number has changed over time. It's a little hard to go back into the data and look at whether that differential has shifted a lot. In principle, you would think, and it's a little higher for younger people, you would think that would be a pretty good inducement. That is it's a significant uplift on the counterfactual of staying put. But so it could be that reflects some of these barriers. But it could also be that perhaps the opportunities in terms of switching jobs aren't quite as attractive as they've been in the past.
Stay with me, Michael. We'll be back in a minute. My guest this morning is Michael Brennan, CEO of the E61 Institute and former chair of the Australian Productivity Commission. What about non-monetary rewards? So for years you hear that people, it's not about the money, it's about lots of other things. Now, all my cohorts from my early days as an economist went into financial markets. It was about money. I'm telling you, it really was. I'm not so sure about that nowadays, or whether it's flexible work practices, whether it's time that they, millennials think differently. How much of that sort of stuff should play into what we're talking about here?
Well, we certainly found some evidence that, particularly for older workers, the differential actually works in the opposite way. So those people who are switching jobs are actually earning less than those who are staying in their existing job. And that clearly must reflect that they're changing jobs for reasons other than straight remuneration. And that could reflect preferences, it could reflect lifestyle issues and that sort of thing. I think for other workers, the biggest question mark, I think, will be the emergence of flexible work, remote work, in particular. And that's something that we haven't yet really had a lot of time to observe. But we may well see two things there. I think a bit of sorting of workers going to those firms where the policy on remote work particularly suits them, and it could suit them either way, the availability of remote work or maybe a strong culture of presence in the workplace. But we might also, it is possible, to your hypothesis, that some workers might see it as advantageous to stay put because it gives them a stronger case to make for those degrees of flexibility, which an employer is more likely to grant to a worker that's incumbent, they're well known, they've got a track record, they're trusted. So that might add to the attraction of staying with an existing employer if you think you can get the right sort of flexibility. So we'll see. That'll be an interesting thing to test.
Is there a good or bad in this, the fact that people don't shift as much? Obviously, we started this off and you said wages growth has been relatively low. So depending on how you judge that as a good or a bad, but it doesn't actually matter.
In one sense, there's no good or bad, and it's wrong to impose a value system on it. There's loyalty is a great attribute, of course, and for those people who stay with an employer and rise through the ranks at an existing employer, of course, that can be a really good thing to do, and it works for a lot of people. It's not that the choice is wrong, it's more whether policy and the broad context is doing something that prevents people from achieving the things that they might otherwise be able to achieve by moving job. And that's two things, I think. It's those areas where there might be a barrier. We talked about non-compete agreements. We talked about occupational licensing. Even skill levels are a two-edged sword. I mean, you could see instances where building up your skills makes you more mobile, but if it's to the point of credentialism, where every narrow occupation has a really specific credential associated with it, then it takes a lot of time to reskill. It takes, if I want to move, if I want to stop being an economist and go and become a high school teacher or something, it's not that attractive if I have to go and do a 4-year teaching degree or even a 2-year master's degree, that sort of thing. So it's often really about those barriers. Then there's another side to it, which is it's possible that the barriers, we suspect the barriers are playing a role, but even if they weren't, it might just be that in a less dynamic economy, maybe there aren't new emerging high productivity firms that are basically offering those attractive endpoints, those attractive destinations, particularly for young workers, so that they can climb that job ladder at a range of different employers. And that too would be a bit of a problem. So you're right. There's no right or wrong choice for any individual. It's more when we step back and look at the aggregate data and we start to worry about whether there are barriers or just less opportunity than there'd been in the past.
Okay, I can't not ask you then about the recent changes in industrial relations legislation, which the crossbenchers have supported. We'll go through around, kind of the right to not involve yourself in work outside hours, around gig workers, around casuals, and the road to becoming permanent. BCA have come out. Some of the big company CEOs have talked about flexibility and the lack of flexibility that provides. They've pushed it onto productivity. Do you agree? Do you think that some of these sorts of changes, and I don't really want to get political here, Michael, but are these sorts of constraints around how workforces are managed, does it have the potential to hurt flexibility and productivity?
Yeah, look, I'm glad you don't want to get political, because I certainly don't want to get political. But I think the broad point is this: flexibility in labour markets is, in general, a good thing. It's important to protect minimum conditions, and Australia has a pretty robust system for doing that. So the award minimum, now the national employment standards that have statutory rules around the minimum set of conditions that you just can't go below. Australia has a high minimum wage. I think that's worked actually pretty well for Australia. So a robust set of minima is important. And then the principle should be above that. I think it really should be as flexible as possible. The ideal is that at the workplace level, bosses and workers are on the same side. They're working cooperatively to find the arrangements that suit them best, and that there's a lot of mutual advantage here. So I think there is a risk in industrial relations, labour law regulations that diminish that flexibility to an extent. The broad direction of change had been to move modestly in the direction of greater flexibility. That has shifted, and we are, seeing a little bit of a return to a degree of increased regulation. Now, it's important to keep it in perspective. Australia has pretty flexible labour markets by global standards, if you compare this to much of the OECD, certainly Europe. But, will it have an effect on productivity? That's a really hard thing to quantify. Just the broad point I'd make about productivity is you just need a whole lot of policy settings set in the right sort of direction, and the risk with diminishing workplace flexibility, which is a pretty broad lever because it affects, a large number of workers across the economy. The risk is that can hold productivity growth back.
Michael, that was an excellent non-political answer. Well done. Thank you for talking to Fear and Greed.
Thank you, Sean.
That was Michael Brennan, CEO of the E61 Institute. That's E61 Institute, and former chair of the Australian Productivity Commission. This is the Fear and Greed Business Interview. Join us every morning for the full episode of Fear and Greed, Australia's best business podcast. I'm Sean Aylmer. Have a great day.